There we go. Okay. Today, of course, we're going to be having Deborah Blum join us, and she is really quite the wonderful speaker. She has, okay, looks like we're most of us here. She is a Pulitzer Prize winner, author of 6 books, most recently The Poison Squad, and she taught here at the University of Wisconsin School of Journalism before moving to Cambridge, Massachusetts, where she is now on the faculty of MIT. So she's certainly done extremely well. And poison is something that she is just fascinated with. So the Poison Squad was just a natural for her. I know some of you have asked about judging for the Worldwide Mustard Competition. What I would like you all to do is send me an email saying, I am interested in judging. And then we will contact you. The very first round of judging will be on, let's see, the 17th of March. So we're getting entries in from all over the world. So I think you'll just find it fun. You do not, there's no reason to do it for extra points because there are no extra points, but there are also no deductions for your class. This is just voluntary. It's just a fun thing to do. So I think you'll enjoy it. Are there any questions about that? Okay. We're just waiting for, let's see, Deborah is here. So I am going to make her a co-host. Hi, Deborah.
That'd be great.
Okay. So I'm going to make you, let's see. Let me find you. Hmm. You are now a co-host. So I've introduced you as a Pulitzer Prize winner and author of 6 books. Most recently, I believe, The Poison Squad, if I'm not mistaken. And you did teach here at the University of Wisconsin, I think for about 15 years in the School of Journalism before moving to Cambridge, and where you are now on the faculty at MIT. Am I correct in all that?
Yes, that's right.
Okay, so take it away.
Thank you. And thanks, Mary. It's really great to be in your class and talk about these issues that I still find really fascinating and important. So I have a PowerPoint, and I am working on another book, but it's about female serial killers. So it's a very different animal. But let me see what I can do here too. Why is this not letting me share what I want to share? Interesting. But I'm not seeing desktop. Hang on a minute. I'm using a new laptop, and that's really what's hanging me up here for just a minute. Hang on. later. Okay, let's see if this works now. Did I just lose you guys?
No, I think we're still good.
Okay, but you can't see the screen, right?
No,
Okay, hang on. Okay, let me try it now. Here we go.
there we go.
Let me just put this into. Okay, hang on. Come on, baby. There. So I'm going to start with this cartoon just because I love it. It's from the 1880s. It's a section of a satirical magazine called Puck, which was published in New York City. And it's from a cartoon about the state of the food supply in the 1880s in the United States. And this is your average American diner or puck reader diner analyzing his dinner, for which he needs a chemistry book in his pocket. He needs a sand extractor for the sugar. He needs to study the rest of his food under a microscope. And in fact, the state of the American food supply, to use a technical term, sucks. Why is that? I'm going to talk about that based largely on this book, The Poison Squad, although I spent some of what I'm going to talk about today has been sort of in the aftermath of that book. I've visited the FDA half a dozen times now to talk, and I'm actually talking about this book at a webinar for the American Chemical Society next week. So I ended up having a lot of give and take with food scientists and food regulators, and some of that's going to play into this. And so I want to start here just as a kind of, how do I think about this? I'm right about science history. Poison Squad is the fourth science history book I've done. And I always sort of look at it like, why does this matter? Because we need to figure out how this particular aspect of our history started. Where did it start? How far have we come? And most important, and this is certainly true when we look at food and drug regulation, have we come far enough? So I want to take you back here to the 19th century, or what I think of as the mythology of 19th century food. And this is kind of where I started when I started thinking about this topic, which was that I had an idea, and you'll certainly hear this from the sort of leading foodies of the time, like Mark Bittman or others of his ilk, Alice Waters, that back in the 19th century, when everyone could spell everything on their table, food was totally wonderful. And don't we wish we could just go back to this wonderful time of farm fresh, happy eating like this? But this is, in fact, first, a rich person's table from the 19th century, and secondly, a complete myth, as I discovered once I got into this topic. So this my book is set, it really starts in the late 19th century in the United States. And it starts in which I'm trying to figure out why Harvey Wiley, who is the chemist at the heart of my story, feels that the food supply is such a mess that he has to devise an experiment. That experiment is nicknamed the Poison Squad, which is the title of my book. He has to devise an experiment in which its premise is, I'm going to poison my coworkers. I'm going to take young clerks at the Department of Agriculture, and I'm going to feed them things in the American food supply, which I know are really dangerous. And that is going to settle the argument, at least in his mind, as to whether the American food supply is dangerous. But why would you get to that point of desperation, right? Why would you be so worried about the American food supply that you would feel that the answer is really one of the strangest public health experiments in history, to feed very bad things to your coworkers? And to get you there, I need to go back here to the 1820s. This is a book that was published in England in 1820, a treatise on the adulteration of food and culinary poisons. The author is the German chemist Frederick Ackham, who had moved to England And this book, I love it in part because of the death, there's death in the pot cover, but it is really focused on heavy metals in the food supply. That is, at this particular time in food history, in England and also, by the way, in the United States, a lot of the materials we use to color food are heavy metal poisons. So, for instance, or metallic poisons. The metalloid poison arsenic is used to create green food coloring. Lead is used to create red and yellow food coloring. Copper sulfate is used to create green feed coloring. And so Ackham's book is really just saying, what in the world are we doing? We're loading everyone up with these really poisonous metals. We need to get these out of the food supply. And guess what? Home cooks, here are some methods in which you can detect them in the food supply yourself, because you're going to need to do that. This does not move to the United States until the 1880s, and it really moves to the United States in a national sense with the chemist at the head of my book, or the center of my book, Harvey Wiley. And he was head of a very small Bureau of Chemistry in the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the Bureau of Chemistry. And this picture is a picture of the entire chemistry staff of the Bureau of Chemistry. I've drawn on it a handy yellow arrow that points to Harvey Wiley, who is a really big guy. But there's other things about this photo that I think are worth noting. One is these guys are not only responsible for food safety and food quality in the United States, they're responsible for all agricultural chemistry at the federal level in the United States. They're responsible for pesticides. They're responsible for soil analyses. There's responsible for figuring out what's going on with the chemistry of certain plants. And so the safety of the American food supply up until this point may have been getting a lot of attention in Europe, but it's been definitely on the very back burner of the Department of Agriculture. And realize that at this point, there is no FDA, there is no EPA, there are no consumer protection agencies, and the USDA is not a consumer protection agency. It has a tiny chemistry bureau, and it has one chief chemist who has just come into office who thinks that the integrity of the food supply matters. And he thinks this because he had come to the USDA from Purdue University. He was a professor of chemistry there. And there, the state of Indiana had hired him to look at fraud in food. And he had discovered massive fraud in all the foods that he looked at, mostly honeys and syrups and jams and jellies and other things in which you could really pretend it was maple syrup when it was really corn syrup. But he comes to Washington, D.C., and he says, well, what about everything, right? Let's just add to the list of the many things we do an analysis of what's going on in American manufactured food. And so they start a series of publications with the incredibly boring title of Bulletin 13. I'm probably the only science journalist in the United States who read every single Bulletin 13. And they look at dairy, and they look at canned goods, and they look at coffee and cocoa and tea and spices, and everywhere they turn, they find poisonous things, and they find fraudulent and faked food. And so what I'm going to do is walk you through a little bit of fraud first, and then talk a little bit about toxicity. And I want to underline the point that all of this is legal. There are no consumer protection agencies, but there are actually no laws at all, except for one law that has to do with putting actual tea in tea bags that exist in the United States at this point. So just briefly, before I go into my focus, which is mostly food and drink, I want to mention other things that are not regulated. Narcotics are completely unregulated. People can put whatever they want into them, and they do. You'll see the American Medical Association at the time in a national state of hand-wringing over this at any given moment. This is a cocaine-enriched wine, Vin Mariani, blessed by the Pope, and which cures, if you look at the ad in which you see the Pope, everything, right? From influenza to thinned hair. There are also medicated soft drinks. As you probably know, the name Coca-Cola derives from the fact that it was originally a cocaine-based drink. And it was a cocaine-based drink in the 1890s. This ad for Coca-Cola is from the inventor of Coca-Cola. And in it, you'll also see that Coca-Cola will cure everything, but also really pep you up. And medicated soft drinks are widely used and completely unregulated at this time. So you may also know that the name 7-Up refers to the fact that 7-Up started as a lithium-based soft drink. There was an antidepressant and a pick you up. And anyone could put this into the soft drink, and there were no safety standards, so you could put as much or as little as you wanted. Both of these things are issues that Wiley eventually will take on. But for the moment, he's focused on fraud in food and drink. And I'm going to start with coffee, which is an essential part of my day. So I kind of obsess about it. So what you see here are some of the canned coffees of the time. And this is a time in which, unlike today, there are not so many enormous national brands. There's a lot of little small companies that make coffee. They make it in an incredibly unregulated way, and they're all kind of scraping out a living. So anything they can do to kind of improve the profit goes. So one of the things about this particular period in the 19th century is if you just say coffee essence, as you see in this particular German jar, essence of coffee essence, you actually don't have to put any coffee in the jar at all. It's essence of coffee, right? So you can put a lot of stuff that actually ends up in stuff that is labeled coffee. But these guys over here, the Splendor coffee and the Reception brand Sincerity coffee, will have a little bit of coffee. But when Wiley and his chemists analyze the coffee, they find it's somewhere between 80 and 95% adulterated or faked. And what do we mean by that? Among the things they find in coffee are charred bone. They find ground shells, they find charred rope, they find roasted seeds of various persuasions, and they find a little coffee, right? One of the interesting things about coffee in this time period is that gradually American consumers start realizing that their coffee is really not waking them up because actually it doesn't contain much coffee. And so you start to see a kind of shift over to coffee beans. And this is at a period where mostly when people would go to the grocery store, if they weren't buying these cans of coffee, the grocers would have beans in a big barrel. And you can find advertisers that go only to the grocers at the time about buying the fake coffee beans now. There's a sudden rise in fake coffee beans that will go into these barrels of coffee beans for sale and increase the grocer's profits. And these are generally made of either clay or wax and dirt. And in fact, there was one public health doc in Indiana who actually suggested that the origin of the phrase, a muddy cup of coffee, came from the fact that basically in the 19th century, Americans were drinking a lot of mud every morning. Spices were worse. Some of them were 100% adulterated. Usually ground shells, right? But a lot of times they would just, factory owners would just sweep the dust up off the floor. It was pretty dirty and put it into pepper, right? Cloves and cinnamon and those reddish spices were pretty routinely mostly brick dust. I've actually asked myself what food tasted like in the 19th century if you were trying to recreate what was going into food. Because when you look at cookbooks of the time, you'll find that cookbook writers will actually put in parentheses, just be aware that the coffee is not really coffee, just be aware that your pepper is probably not going to be pepper. I mean, there's a lot of awareness of just how bad this is. And so what you find, as illustrated in the spice can, is that manufacturers don't actually start putting real pepper in or cloves into the cans, but they tell consumers that they do by calling them pure. And so there's a lot of talk about pure food in the moment. There's the pure food movement. There are pure food congresses. You see here pure rye, because whiskey is also so faked at the time. Right. Instead of being actual rye, it's usually synthetic ethanol brewed up in a laboratory, dyed, and then there were formulas you could add to flavor your dyed ethanol. It's kind of like scotch or kind of like rye, and you could actually put in special mixes that would make the whiskey cling to the glass the way real whiskey does. And so you start to see manufacturers overtly and heavy-handedly say, hey, this is the real deal. It's pure. It's not blended. It's not adulterated. It's never been sold in bulk. Let's just reassure the consumer. Because by now, almost everyone is starting to get that what they're buying is not necessarily what's on the label. In addition, and I want to kind of shift over to this, there's an awful lot, as Frederick Ackham mentioned, of very poisonous stuff going into food completely legally. And a case study for this is probably milk in all kinds of ways. This is a cartoon by the political cartoonist Thomas Nash. And if you've ever looked at cartoons from early in American political history, where you start to see, fat cat politicians and politicians from Tammany Hall, those are Thomas Nash. But in this case, he's looking at milk. And in this particular cartoon, he's looking at a common practice in 19th century milk, which was to water it down before it was sold in market. And there were formulas. I want to say it was about 20 to 30% milk to 40% milk to 60% water, sometimes more. The milk would then turn blue or gray. They would then recolor it with powdered substances, plaster of Paris, chalk, right? And then they would put it into these barrels and they would take it off to market. And often, this is also a Nash cartoon, dairymen at the big farmers markets, especially for people who had very little money, would just have these big containers of milk, and you would pay to have as much milk as you could afford, sort of dippered out of the container. And as you see in this cartoon, Nash has portrayed the dairyman, which is what they were called at the time, as death. So why would that be? Well, milk is really dangerous anyway in the 19th century. It's not pasteurized. Milk is a wonderful substrate for pathogenic bacteria. And in the 19th century, there were a lot that, we've managed to weed out a lot through years of pasteurization, brucellosis, bovine tuberculosis, some really bad actors floating around in milk. And there was no refrigeration, right? There's no electricity. There's no gas-powered refrigerators at this point. And so the milk would spoil fairly quickly and the bacteria would really go to town. So one of the things the dairy industry realizes post the Civil War is that there are chemical preservatives that might be useful in that regard. And the most popular preservative of the Civil War was formaldehyde, which was synthesized by the Germans about the time of the Civil War. And so during the Civil War, formaldehyde was the #1 preservative for the many tens of thousands of people who were killed. And the American dairy industry has like this light bulb moment in which it says, wow, that really works well to preserve a rotting body. I wonder what it would do for rotting milk. And as it turns out, it does a great job with rotting milk. There are compounds in the formaldehyde which will actually help block some of the coagulation of rotting milk. And formaldehyde, I'm telling you this because people have told me this, not because I've ever swigged down formaldehyde, but formaldehyde has a sweet taste. So when you put the formaldehyde into the milk, the sour milk tasted better. And so the dairymen go, wow, this is the answer to our problems. We'll just put formaldehyde in the milk. It won't decay. We won't have so many pathogenic bacteria. And we can say to our customers, which we did, look, you can take this milk. You can leave it on the counter for 2 weeks. All will be well. But they didn't tell the consumers they were putting formaldehyde in the milk. There was no requirements that you had to label anything. And they didn't call it formaldehyde. They called it things like rosaline or preservaline. And because there were no laws saying, well, okay, you can put this in milk, but you have to put a relatively safe amount. Dairymen would go, wow, a little bit is very helpful. What if I poured a lot of formaldehyde into the milk? And so you start seeing this across the United States. This is, you see embalmed milk scandals. This is one from Omaha, in which you have the county health department telling parents, please don't, please do not give your children milk. It's poisonous. Children are getting really sick. There was, I want to say about 1898, a embalmed milk, incredible outbreak in Indianapolis that killed about 400 children over the period of the summer. No one was prosecuted. It's completely legal to put this in milk, right? But this is happening across the country. And at the same time, really briefly, formaldehyde and other not so wonderful preservatives are being used in meat. I just put this up there. The big packers, mostly headquarters, some in Wisconsin, of course, a lot in Chicago, Swift, Armour, Cudahy, are all using different preservatives in milk. And we end up, and this is a cartoon that resulted from that, with something coming out of the Spanish-American War called the embalmed beef scandal, in which there were colonels and generals in the American Army who said that the meat supplied to the American soldiers in Cuba killed more of them than the Spanish did. And this ended up being a huge hearing in the U.S. Department of the Army. It was called the embalmed beef scandal. And interestingly enough, in which soldier after soldier talked about how bad the meat was and how sick it made them, including Teddy Roosevelt. What actually happened was that the Army discovered that the really crummy beef that was being fed to soldiers in Cuba was exactly the same beef that was on the shelves of the American grocery store. And so the Army declared itself free of all blame because, hey, just standard practice. But this is another cartoon from Puck that came out of that, seeing people again starting to go, what in the world am I eating? Right. Putrefied pork, deodorized ham, decayed roast beef, as you see in this cartoon, tuberculosis lamb. And so there's a growing mistrust of the American food supply, but the food processors and the meat packers have put so much money into Congress. This will surprise you today, I know, that every single effort to pass a food and drug law fails. So finally, here's Harvey Wiley. Sorry, a much older Harvey Wiley than in 1883. This is about 20 years later. And he's just had it. And he decides to come up with this experiment I was describing that he calls hygienic table trials, and that the Washington Post calls the Poison Squad. And this is actually a picture of members of the Poison Squad. So who are they? They're young clerks at the U.S. Department of Agriculture. They actually had to sign a liability waiver as part of this. But the way this works is that Wiley actually built a kitchen in the dining room in the basement of the old USDA building. This is the dining room. He had young male athletes. This is, again, early 20th century. So as you see, this is super white. He picked young men because by the standards of the time, young male college athletes were sort of the healthiest of all specimens. These had all been college athletes. He wasn't trying to kill them. And he had a theory that if these guys showed any ill effects from what was being given to them, then that would send a bigger signal that this was more dangerous for people who weren't as healthy, for the elderly, for children, everyone who is eating what I'm about to describe to you. So the way it basically worked is at any given time, you had several tables. All of them were eating exactly the same thing. Everyone in this experiment has to eat in this dining room 3 meals a day, 7 days a week, and they have to be blood tested and urine tested and all of these different tests and keep a food diary. And the only difference, the food's fabulous. It's that actual farm fresh, amazing, unpreserved food that I've been telling you doesn't exist, right? They hire a professional high-end chef. Everything is delicious. But at one of these tables at any given moment, there's going to be capsules that contain the preservative or additive that Wiley is particularly interested in at the time. And during the several weeks of each additives test run, he's going to ratchet up the dose. So it's going to start pretty low and it's going to get increasingly high. One of them was formaldehyde. They had to call that. The people got so sick so fast that they just shut that experiment down. But the first one was borax. And you'll probably see borax in the grocery store. It's in the cleaning supplies section, 20 mule team borax, right? It's the exact same thing that was going into meat and butter, cheese, right? Wiley picked it as the starting additive because he thought it was benign. He actually thought it was relatively benign. There's almost no public health research at this time, as I found when I was looking at this book. You'll find a scientist here or there who's been feeding bad things to their neighbors or experimenting on themselves. A very small number of animal experiments, but epidemiology, public health studies, forensic toxicology, health studies are pretty much non-existent at this time. So one of the things that's so profound about this experiment is not that it's perfect, because it's not, but that it's, a controlled study with comparison groups done in a fairly methodical way. It gets a huge amount of attention, partly thanks to the Washington Post calling it the poison squad and other papers, becoming fascinating with the idea of a federal chemist poisoning federal workers. And every single part of this experiment gets a lot of coverage. This is a New York Times summary of that first borax experiment, in which I like it, and I've only put part of it up here, because if you look at the first graph, you see what it says: the young men who have been eating poisons, right? And what underlies that is these are poisons in everyone's everyday diet. Borax, people eat borax, every single meal, basically. And there are actual food chemists at the time who have worked out how often you eat borax. So here are these guys, they've gotten really sick, they've surprised everyone. Wiley himself said that he was shocked by these results, and you see a moment for him. This is about 1902. 1903, that he is starting to go, I've had it. I've been trying to get a law passed, which he had now for almost 20 years. Clearly, being the nice, polite chemist isn't going to work. I'm actually going to be a pushy crusader. And you do see him shift to that, and you see a huge amount of public approval of this, right? Cartoons and stories all over the country praising Wiley, talking about how bad the food supply is. It's not just borax, it's also formaldehyde, it's also arsenic, it's also copper sulfate, it's also sodium benzoate is actually still in the food supply, but that was one of the ones he looked at. Salicylic acid, which is the compound in aspirin that makes your stomach bleed, was in a lot of beers and wines in the United States. He looks at that and he keeps saying, we're dosing people with multiple doses of these things. We're not labeling anything. We have to set safety standards. He pushes and pushes and pushes, gets shot down every single time. And then finally, in 1906, as you guys can see, this is my super fast tour through this material. A socialist writer named Upton Sinclair publishes a book called The Jungle. Upton Sinclair had actually first published it in a socialist newspaper called Appeal to Reason, which was published in Kansas, which at that time, showing you the United States has changed quite a bit. Kansas was a leading center of socialism in the United States, and the Appeal to Reason was published there. And The Jungle first appeared in Appeal to Reason as a serial novel. He acquired a New York publisher who And he did something else, and that I should explain. In creating this book, he went to the packing yards in Chicago. He was really poor, which was why he had become a socialist. So he blended right in with all these immigrant workers who were working in the packing houses, and he embedded himself in these packing houses. And so when you read The Jungle is actually this fictional story of a Lithuanian immigrant family working in these packing houses in which they're just trying to survive in very brutal circumstances, which was really why Upton Sinclair had written the book, The Plight of the Worker. But he also vividly describes the situation of the packing houses because he was there. And so, you see all the mold-covered carcasses that go into the meat supply and the dead rats that get kicked into the sausage, and the workers. In one case in this book, a worker actually ends up in one of the live vats and gets turned into lard. And so all of this goes into the book. His horrified publisher cancels the contract, refuses to publish the book. He finally finds another publisher in Doubleday Page, which is the forerunner of the modern Doubleday. And they won't publish it until they send fact checkers to Chicago. And when they send fact checkers to Chicago, the fact checkers come back and say, oh, it's absolutely worse than in the book. They publish the book. They send a copy to Roosevelt. The book comes out. Everyone reads it. The book is like a bonfire because people are so pissed off about the state of the food supply. And now look at this novel talking about, rotting animals going into the sausage and dead rats in the potted ham, and people are just beside themselves. So Roosevelt, who is president at this point, says, okay, I'm going to send my own fact checkers to Chicago. And they go, and even though the packing houses have been warned that they're coming, the fact checkers, Roosevelt's fact checkers, come back and they say, oh, it's so much worse than in the book, right? And one of the things I remember from the excerpts of their report that got published was there were open pit latrines throughout these packing houses. And at one point, when our guys are standing there, the workers accidentally drop a pig right into the latrine. And then they just pick it up, don't wash it off, throw it back into the food, the processing chain. And so Roosevelt goes to Congress. By this time, this thing was a bonfire. And he says, listen, I want a Meat Inspection Act. He actually doesn't say, I want a Food and Drug Act, right? He's already said to people he doesn't think that law will ever pass. But he wants a Meat Inspection Act because this is a complete bonfire. And Congress says, oh, no, we're not going to do that. He says, well, if you don't, I'm going to publish some of this report. And he does. He publishes, I think it's about a tenth of the report. The whole report has never been published. It's actually somewhere hidden at the National Library of Agriculture. But he publishes excerpts of the report. When European countries see these excerpts, they cancel all their meat supply contracts with the United States on the minute. The meatpacking industry realizes that they've got to control this damage, and they go back to Congress and they say, yes, we're in on a Meat Inspection Act. And so in 1906, the Meat Inspection Act passes in June, and in this sort of tidal wave of consumer fury over food and drugs, they resurrect the Food and Drug Act. And it also passes in 1906, right? And one of the things I want to say about these two acts, and I'll go back to them a little bit later, these are the first real consumer protection laws in the United States, right? It's the first time that the US federal government, in its way, says that when the preamble of the Constitution says promote the general welfare, it actually includes protecting people's general welfare in their everyday lives. And we are going to put these two acts into play. And every single consumer protection law or agency that is followed, the FDA, the EPA, OSHA, all of them are based on the precedent set by these two acts in 1906. Wiley does not stay, however, all that long after these acts. He's there about another 5 years. He helped shepherd in the new law, and he's incredibly absolutist about the fact that these are Consumer Protection Acts. He wants to give the American industry no quarter. And although Teddy Roosevelt and the Secretary of Agriculture certainly have supported the passage of these acts, they don't feel that way. And so during this 5 years, there's this gradual, increasingly friendly handshake between the American food and drink industry and the Roosevelt and then the Taft administrations to water down the Food and Drug Act. And Wiley's position eventually becomes untenable. They actually bring fake charges against them that Taft has to shoot down. And he leaves the federal government. He goes over to the then crusading magazine, Good Housekeeping, which creates the Good Housekeeping seal of approval for products for him. And he writes about advocacy columns about food and drink, and is widely considered the founder of the modern FDA, although he never was. Going backwards just for a minute, what happens is that he continues to advocate just for the fact that this law, needs to be put into place in the way that it was intended. That's not happening. He gets increasingly bitter about that, and he and his colleagues also recognize that there are all kinds of loopholes and problems with the law, and eventually another scandal. Our consumer protection laws tend to be scandal driven, but another scandal in 1937, which involves cough syrup sweetened by ethylene diglycol. If you don't know ethylene diglycol, it's basically antifreeze. There's a little company in Tennessee that makes a cough syrup for children called Elixir sulfamilinide. They flavor it with raspberry and sweeten it with antifreeze. Children start dropping dead across the country. This is not illegal, right? And so in that, as a response to that scandal and the constant lobbying by Wiley until his death in 1930 and other members of the Bureau of Chemistry and then the early Food and Drug Bureau, we get the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act in 1938, which is in fact the foundation of the modern FDA. After this book came out, and I kind of love this slide, so I'm sharing it with you. I spent a lot of time talking to high school chemistry teachers because they use different books that I've done to kind of talk to students about chemistry and how it works. And this is a particular experiment that was done that kind of illustrates one of the points of our modern food supply. And this was an experiment he had his students do. So if you look at this, he's bought a can from the Dollar Tree of green giant sweet peas, and those kind of unattractive looking gray-green peas are the ones that came out of that can. And that's sort of the modern canned pea look, because we cannot use the materials under modern laws to, fake color them. The very bright green peas there are actually colored with copper sulfate, which was what was used in Wiley's time. And as you see, it works. It creates this wonderful experience in which we actually see bright green peas. And this image on the left is what he and his students did. They made a slurry of those green peas. They stuck a nail in it head first and left it there for a couple of days. And as you see from that picture, the copper comes out of the peas and redeposits on the nail, which is exactly what would happen if you were eating them yourself. The copper does not stay bound to these peas, right? So that if you were continually eating the Wiley era version of green peas, you would be continually absorbing copper, and copper actually can be very toxic, and it's a bioaccumulating heavy metal, so you really do not want to be continually eating it. But I like this because it's a good example of the fact that the laws we put in place actually do protect us, and they work. And yes, our peas are not as beautiful, but they're a whole lot safer. There's another point I want to make about the passage of those laws, and these are 2019 appropriations. I'm still using them because actually those numbers have changed almost not at all over the last 5 years. But under the Meat Inspection Act, right? The U.S. Department of Agriculture inspects about 10 to 20% of our food supply, mostly meat and poultry, eggs. And for that, they get $1 billion, right, give or take. The FDA, which is funded through the Food and Drug Act of 1906, inspects roughly 80 or more percent of our food supply, and they get almost exactly the same amount as the USDA. And that is strictly related to what happened in 1906. There are things that we have updated. We certainly updated with the 1938 Food and Drug and Cosmetics Act, but what we didn't update was the funding mechanism. And so the funding mechanisms for these two acts, because the scandal drove the Meat Inspection Act, and the Food and Drug Law was this poor, battered political football for so many years, we just don't see the FDA getting the money it needs to do the food inspections that actually we should have done. So going back to my question, where did we start? How far have we come? Have we come far enough? Yeah, we've come a long way. Have we come far enough? Probably not. And to that end, I want to run by you a few CDC estimates of foodborne illness in the United States. So in the 19th century, any good food historian will tell you that the 19th century is generally known as the century of the Great American Stomachache. Food, not just poisonous milk, but food tended to make people pretty sick. There was a lot of foodborne bacteria. There were a lot of very poisonous things in food. Arsenic, lead, formaldehyde, borax. People got sick, and food is generally considered to have been among the top 10 causes of death in the 19th century, not obviously in the 21st century, and these numbers are pretty small, right? We think that there's about 3,000 deaths related to food and foodborne illnesses every year, right? It's these other numbers that I've stressed here because I find them really interesting, right? Although there are only 3,000 deaths a year, and if you're in the unlucky 3,000, I'm going to sound completely cold-hearted when I say that's a small number compared to many other deaths, categories of death in the U.S., firearms, say. But we also have about 47 million foodborne illnesses a year. Of those, we actually don't know the cause of all that many of them, right? There's about 9.4 million that are attributed to known pathogens, and the majority of them are attributed to unknown causes. So again, have we come as far as we need to come? No, because there's a lot of people getting sick, even if they aren't dying from food in the American food supply for reasons that we do not fully understand. Do I think we should understand it? You bet I do, right? Would that cost a whole lot of money that we so far haven't been willing to spend? It absolutely would. So this is from the poster for the PBS documentary based on this book, and I put it up here partly because I really love the skull and crossbones in the plate, but partly because I want to come back to the fact that this poison squad experiment is a fundamental public health experiment, right? It wasn't the only factor in driving these policy and legal changes, but it was the experiment that raised public awareness to the point that when we were ready to tip, we tipped. And Harvey Wiley gets a lot of credit for his absolute bullheaded refusal to give up on this issue for a solid 40 years. So I've put in a few food trivia questions, which I've only given you the answer to one of these actually in this talk, which is the elixir sulfamylinide scandal. That's from some newspaper coverage at the time. Food trivia. Can anyone guess what the nickname for the Food and Drug Act was? I've only mentioned this person's name about 700 times in this talk, so you can probably guess that it was called the Wiley Act at the time. The stimulant Wiley tried to remove from Coca-Cola was not cocaine, it was caffeine. And it's a really fascinating moment. The Coca-Cola trial in which he sues Coca-Cola over the amount of caffeine in Coca-Cola, which was about the amount of a oversized Red Bull today. I mean, they weren't messing around with caffeine once they took cocaine out of the Coca-Cola. Is a really fascinating look at how we study the effect of stimulants on human beings and are they dangerous. I mean, some of the pioneering public health work on studying stimulants like caffeine came out of this particular lawsuit. And finally, I don't expect you to know this, although maybe you have learned this in this class. Do you know this? Anyone here know the scandal that helped inspire the Food Safety Modernization Act, FSMA, which passed under Obama in 2011? Well, I will tell you. Because I've actually looked at this in a kind of going forward way. That was the Peanut Corporation of America scandal, which involves some absolutely brilliant work by epidemiologists, not in the federal government, but Minnesota. Minnesota has an amazing team of public health epidemiologists. And their Peanut Corporation of America made that cheap peanut butter that goes into like peanut butter cracker sandwiches and stuff, and supplied nursing homes and other places that wanted cheap, large jars of peanut butter. And the only thing was that they they were not being inspected, and they had sort of created these secret factories in which rats ran amok, and mold, aflatoxin, which is the very lethal mold that grows in peanut butter, was all over the place. And so really over 100 people were killed in that scandal, and that was the scandal that made the federal government say we have got to update food safety laws and implement the Food Safety Modernization Act. Slowed down some in the Trump administration and is kind of creaking forward again in the Obama administration. This is the full pot cover. Look before you eat. I would certainly suggest to you should still do that for a number of reasons, but I would also say, and I mean this, we have come a long way since the 19th century, right? This is a case study in why consumer protection laws matter. We tend to talk about regulation as if it's some, anathema and blight on the land, but it actually, in many cases, is about protecting us, and it actually does save lives. And again, in a Harvey Wiley-like way, I'll say that if we actually enforce the laws we have, people in this country would probably be even more safe than they are today. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Questions for Deborah? I'm sure there are questions. Elizabeth.
Hi.
Go ahead.
Hi, sorry, I was just clapping.
Oh, thank
okay.
you. All claps taken. Right.
Some questions.
I have a question, if that's okay.
Sure,
Sure.
go ahead.
You maybe kind of touched on this a little bit with funding for the FDA, but do you have a sense for what the modern and forward fight for Wiley or the people like Wiley would be, besides just continued funding for the thing that they fought for originally?
Sure. I mean, there's a couple of, one that I kind of like and one that I think is the more logical one and was partly behind FSMA, and that is we can really detect contaminants and bacteria and bad actors at a very fine level right now. And some of the things that, we look at in the modern food supply are kind of low dose toxicology issues. So some of it is just putting in place the sort of tests that we can use, and the computer modeling, and I know the FDA is trying to move this way, computer modeling of risk, so that without, doubling the workforce, which would be wonderful in some ways, we can actually put more muscle behind detection methods, right? And so I think that one of the things we need to do is really take advantage of modern science and modern science detection. We can detect things at the part per billion level, and there are contaminants in food that are actually dangerous at that level. I think we should totally put some money and some muscle into those. I actually also think we should put some old-fashioned money into, hiring more people to do this work. And I think that we should look more probably, and I'm picking here things like contamination. When you start seeing that romaine lettuce is bad, a lot of times that has to do with contaminated water. And so again, I think that one of the things we need is, and there's certainly another move for this among people who used to work at food safety at both USDA and FDA, there's a push to create a new food safety agency that would combine elements of the FDA and elements of the USDA and make food a focus, right? And I kind of think that's probably a smart idea. I think the FDA does way too much, and it would probably make sense, since all of us eat every single day, to say, let's have an agency that just focuses on this. I would like to see the US, I don't know that I think this is ever likely to happen, we tend in the US to use the generally recognized as safe model rather than the precautionary model used in the EU. There are points where I think we might be better off using the precautionary model. There are a lot of components that go into the US food and drugs and cosmetics that are banned in Europe. Some of them probably should be taken out of the US food supply, right? In fact, I know they should, right? Sorry, I'm saying right way too much here. But
Can
I
you
would
give
like
an example?
Sure. So an example, a really easy example is probably titanium dioxide. Titanium dioxide came into the US food supply under the generally recognized as safe system. It's a long time whitening agent. It's been used in hardware store products, paints, right? It hasn't killed anyone in the many years of its hardware-like use. And so it moved over into the food supply and the cosmetic supply in a generally recognized as safe protocol. You'll see it obviously in sunscreens. And it's used in a lot of colored foods, right? Like if you get a pastel colored candy, quite often it's a mixture of aniline coal tar food dye. All of our food dyes today tend to be, derived from aniline coal tar dyes, and titanium dioxide. There is evidence to show that we probably shouldn't be eating quite so much titanium dioxide, but legally it's permissible in the US system, and it's banned in quite a few food products in Europe. That's one example. People have talked about, Ryan, what is it? It's a compound that goes into bread. Comes up a lot, is banned. It's a brominated, is it a brominated hydrocarbon? It's a brominated compound, and I'm blanking on the second part of that. It's banned in the US. It's in the EU as a suspected carcinogen and permitted in the US. And I think the FDA is actually taking that one up. There was like a bunch of scandals about it, a couple, at least media scandals. You're eating the same thing in your Subway breads that you're eating in your yoga mats, that are in your yoga mats. And so it's a compound, again, generally recognized as safe in yoga mats, permitted in the US food supply, right? So those are a couple examples of that, right? There's formaldehyde permitted in some US cosmetics. I've noticed a shift away from that in nail polishes. If you get into nail polish and you look at products like Opie, you'll see them saying formaldehyde free now, right? That's a sort of seep over from the fact that formaldehyde is banned in nail polish in the EU and not in the United States. So those are some examples. I'd argue for more label transparency. We have labels now, thanks to the Food and Drug Act, right? Are they perfect? No. Right. Do we have all the information we need? We're always told to be informed consumers, and we're never given all the information we need, right? So when you see natural flavorings on a can of flavored salsa, do you know what they are? They're usually almost entirely not natural, right? I think Environmental Working Group just got FDA to ban a couple of natural flavorings because they were suspected carcinogens. How is the informed consumer supposed to know this, right? I often say to people, the FDA does many things well, many things poorly, does a terrible job about communicating risk. So if you wanted to figure out which lipsticks are highest in lead, for instance, skipping over the cosmetics here, you can find that in the FDA website if you actually know it's there, and you can work your way through the labyrinth of that website, but most people don't know that. Right. They don't know which lipsticks are high in lead and which aren't. And yet you really don't want to be putting lead on your lips every day. Right. So, the other thing I would argue, and certainly Wiley was the first federal scientist to hire a science writer. He actually hired a science writer for the Department of Agriculture in the mid 1880s. I mean, he was way ahead of his time. But we do not, our government, which on the one hand tells us to be informed consumers, does a really sucky job of giving us the information to make choices. So I would fix all of that.
Any other questions?
That was a long answer.
No, I appreciate it. It was a great answer. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now, the caffeine question came up in the U.S. Supreme Court. So I
Yes.
asked all of you to read U.S. versus Coca-Cola, the 1916 thing, and what did the Supreme Court decide? If someone will just tell me. Okay. Let's see. I asked you all to read it, so Dan? What did the Supreme Court decide on that? Are you there? How about Amy? Chris? Someone? Chime in. Well, they said it was legal. So the question is, what is about caffeine in the human body? Why is there caffeine in soda? Anyone know? Well, and which contains more caffeine? Anyone want to guess? Either regular Coke or Diet Coke?
I think
That's-
Diet Coke.
Yeah, Diet Coke. Yep, Diet Coke has about a third more milligrams of caffeine. But the question is why? And we're not going to go into that first, but why do soft drinks like Coca-Cola and Mountain Dew contain caffeine? Well, caffeine is a central nervous system stimulant. We know that people drink coffee because of the buzz it gives them, allowing them to concentrate better. I imagine, how many of you, and show me by hands, how many drink coffee in the morning? Quite a few. But what's fascinating is that some of these drinks, some of the popular beverages also contain caffeine. And it's worth noting that caffeine traditionally was a natural part of cola drinks. Soft drinks like manufacturers like Coca-Cola use the extract of the cola nut to prepare the drink, and caffeine is usually present in the cola nut. Even extracts of the coca plant used to be included. However, if you look at the ingredients, you won't find those things, but they still use it. Why? Well, for one thing, and also in 1980, the USDA proposed eliminating caffeine from soft drinks, but it didn't happen. And one of the things that the soft drink industry said was it's essential to the flavor. Well, is it? There have been a couple of studies that really show that there's no additional flavor that's added. Now, it may be the combination of high sugar levels in fizzy soda, along with a small amount of caffeine. And again, it's less than a cup of coffee. Cup of coffee is generally about 100 milligrams, 20, I think it's 26 milligrams of caffeine in a can of Diet Coke, in regular Coke, 36 or so in Diet Coke, and then about 54 in Mountain Dew. So maybe that's why if you have ever kind of withdrawn from caffeine, while you will get a buzz or withdrawal symptoms. So it could be that it's just another way of doing it. Anyway, there was also US versus 95 barrels, more or less, of apple cider vinegar. And could someone tell me what that case meant? And would that case, if brought today, first of all, if it were brought today, it wouldn't be brought by the FDA. There's no way, because they don't have the resources. But
Right.
also, I'm not sure it would even succeed today, because it did find, the court did find that it was mislabeled because of the dehydrated apples that were in it. But if you were, for example, if you put on the label made from dehydrated apples on the backside, I suspect that there are cases, there are courts that would just say that's okay under the reasonable consumer standard. So I have a question, and that is, Belvita, you can see there's a little label that says made with real cheese. Anyone have an idea of who brought this case? You've seen him.
I'll venture a guess and say it was Spencer.
Yes, it was. It was. And now, yes, it was Spencer. It's Siska versus Kraft Heinz Foods. And the cheese sauce in it has got whey, canola oil, cheddar cheese, which is milk, cheese, culture, salt, enzymes, whey protein concentrate, milk protein concentrate. What Spencer is arguing in his complaint is that this is not real cheese. How would Kraft Heinz defend it? Anyone? Well, they would say, yes, in addition to the whey, the canola oil, the whey protein concentrate, the milk protein concentrate, there is cheddar cheese. So as a result, there is real cheese in it. It's just not all real cheese. So I have a feeling that the court is going to deny the motion. What about boneless wings? Anyone know what boneless wings are?
No.
Are they really boneless wings?
I think they're just grounded up chicken parts, right?
Yeah,
Like a chicken nugget.
yeah. They're basically chicken nuggets, but they are not boneless wings. By calling them boneless wings, do you think they are fraudulent? Does anyone believe that boneless wings are actually the wings of chickens that were deboned? I got to tell you, I thought that. I did. And someone said, no, that's impossible. There's no way you could debone a wing and come up with what you're doing. So I don't think that would fly. Anyone know what greenwashing is? What does the word greenwashing mean?
Is that marketing products to make them seem sustainable or natural or something like that?
Yeah, essentially marketing when they're really not. So you put something like, for example, Chips Ahoy, and there's a case involving Oreo, again, Mondelez International, which is a big company that manufactures Oreos, Cliff Bars, um, and Chips Ahoy and Toblerone, claiming that, in fact, they are not, in fact, environmentally friendly. So, for example, let's see. Okay, come on. All right, it's not going. Oh. So you could see in the upper left corner, sustainably sourced cocoa with a symbol. Well, the case, then I will send it to you, is claiming that, in fact, it is not sustainably sourced and that the people who farm the cocoa are mistreated, even though they claim not to be. So that's another case. What I would like you to think about, and I've got possible papers, topics for papers. So are standards of identity even relevant anymore? The NLEA of 1990. Should there be one safety agency? Right now, safety is left to the FDA and the Department of Agriculture. Food recalls, the legacy of Jack in the Box. And by the way, I will send all of these to you for you to pick. Calorie disclosure laws for restaurants, are they effective? Can you protect chef creativity? Kosher food laws in the First Amendment. What is the meaning of organic? The pink slime controversy. The names of plant-based foods like almond milk or Impossible Burger. The problem with expiration dates. Wisconsin's cheeseburger law. The cheeseburger law, by the way, immunizes food institutions or food groups, food restaurants, food producers from being sued because they got fat or they got some illness. What is the role of nonprofit food advocacy groups? Trans fats. What's the history of trans fats and what has happened to them? Salt, the hidden dangers in food. The reasonable consumer standard. Is it really reasonable? And we've talked about this. US versus other countries' food laws, including the GRAS, generally recognized as safe, versus the precautionary model. Natural flavors, what on earth do they mean? Preservatives, what are they? And if you put something on your label that says preservative free, but there's something like malic acid or citric acid, is it a preservative? Sugar and obesity. The role of school lunches. Plastic in food packaging and the so-called ag-gag laws. Those are laws that would prohibit people from filming in slaughterhouses. So I will send you all of those. I think there are 24 of those, and I would like you all to pick them, to pick one of them. What I would like you to do is put your first 3 choices. So if you would all do that, and then I will assign you. And any other questions? Let me see. Okay, that's it. I'm pretty well done because I thought that Deborah was going to take a little more time. Any questions? Deborah, thank you again for being available and for speaking to the class again.
It was an absolute pleasure. It's always great to see you. And you guys, if any questions come up that I can answer, don't hesitate to get
Yeah,
in
and
touch.
I will include her email as well. So if you don't mind, Deborah.
You bet. You
Okay.
guys take care.
Thank
Bye.
you. Okay, I think we're done. That will be it. Next week will be another adventure in food law. Okay, see y'all.